Welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today I'm delighted to welcome back virtually one of my favorite authors, Aimie K Runyan, whose new book is Mademoiselle Eiffel. Before we begin, the Poison Pen does have copies of Mademoiselle Eiffel on order, and we would be happy to hold one for you or put one in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore. Now I'd like to welcome Aimie K Runyan.
Thank you so much, John. It's so great to be back.
Thank you for joining us again. For those that might not know who you are, you did have a life before you became a published author. What can
Mhm.
you tell us about Aimie before you wrote your first book?
I was a French teacher. That was my main career from the age of 24 through about 33. And I actually ended up teaching online for a number of years after that, before it was even cool. Um, but yeah, I taught in the classroom. I taught French, English, and competitive speech and debate, mostly in a number of high schools in Colorado. I'd build up a French program. They'd cancel it, so I'd have to move on to the next high school, which was rough. But then I started teaching online. And when my kids were born, so I was able to be home, which was great. But then the writing sort of took off, and I was able to let the teaching go for the most part. I'm still teaching for Drexel University, go Dragons, and which is wonderful to, kind of stay in the classroom virtually. Yeah.
Now, I know early on you wanted to be a writer, like back in the third grade or something like
Mhm.
that. But when did you kind of really pursue it as a professional kind of career?
I took two creative writing classes when I was in graduate. I took two attempts at grad school. The first time, it just was a bad fit. I really should have followed my French teacher's advice and found a French studies program instead of French linguistics. I would have been much happier. But I took a couple of creative writing classes because I had time in my schedule. And I picked up and dropped the idea that would become my first novel. I started it in one of those classes, and then over the course of 10 years, I picked it up and dropped it a lot. Because I really wanted to do it, but I was busy, starting a new career, getting married, having a couple of kids, and it was time to find, it was hard to justify taking the time to do it. It wasn't that I couldn't make the time, it was hard to justify such a mentally engaging activity sometimes. Because reading, while it's mentally engaging, you can pick it up and put it down and it doesn't matter as much, to a certain degree. And but finally, when I was 33 and my youngest daughter, or well, my daughter, who's my youngest child, was sleeping through the night, I figured, and I was starting to regain a sense of sanity. I realized that I'm 33. My grandmother passed away at 99. Her mother passed away at 99. So I'm a third of the way at best, probably, through this whole thing called life. And I wanted to do something big, but with two kids under the age of 3, I couldn't exactly pick up and go traveling to the Taj Mahal or what have you. But I could take a couple hours every day while the kids were napping to write. And I was still teaching a full load online, but I was home all day and I was able to maneuver my schedule well enough to be able to find 2 hours a day to write. And it was my escape, it was my safe haven. And that I picked up Promise to the Crown, which was then called Days of Plenty or some horrible thing. And I figured if I write 3 chapters and then I'm going to commit to that 3 chapters, and if I like it, I'll keep going. And I did. And 6 months later, I had a really terrible draft, and I revised it. And then I went to Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers Conference, and I finaled in a conference there, which was a big kind of boost. Like, I'm on the right track. There are a lot of people attending this conference, and to get that little, golden halo, so to speak, was, it felt like I definitely have a shot. It felt like a tremendous long shot, but I said, why not? And I made some wonderful contacts there, like Susan Spann, who's a wonderful mystery writer who would become a mentor for me. And it was less than a year after that that I had an agent. Because I went to the conference September, had an agent by March, which is incredible, and a book deal 4 months after that. It was, the closest thing to an overnight success you're going to hear. Even though those books were slow to start, they did find an audience eventually. But yeah, that's how it all got started.
Wow. And now you're an established writer, and your latest book
Yes.
is Mademoiselle Eiffel, which is just out in bookstores and libraries. What can you tell us about the book?
Well, it's kind of an unknown story. I was really excited to find it when I was looking for something to follow up A Bakery in Paris, which was a very beloved book of mine, which takes place, I mean, the half that I really wanted to follow up on takes place in 1870, 1871. And I thought it would be great to show Paris 10, 15, 20 years later, because, 1870, 1871 with the siege of Paris and the Paris Commune was a low point as far as safety and security and everything for Paris. And so I wanted to show it at its zenith. And that's the Belle Epoque. And 1889 was the pinnacle of, French, the French cultural
Pleasure.
domination of the world. And I wanted to show that off. And so I found the story of Claire Eiffel, the oldest daughter of the famous architect, made a tower we've all seen on TV a lot lately. And I thought if she took over for the running of her household and the raising of her four younger siblings when her mother passed away, and Claire was only 14. But not only did she take over those expected roles, she became her father's right-hand woman and lived with him for the rest of his life, even though she married. And she wasn't an old maid by any stretch. She was, I want to say, and I should know this, but it's been a minute since I did the research, not even mid-20s, 24 when she
Mm.
married. And so she spent 10 years, 9 or 10 years, as, the head of her father's household. And she kind of migrated into this world where she would be running two households under the same roof, her father's and her husband's. But she was deeply involved in the business affairs of the Compagnie Eiffel. And I wanted to show that it wasn't just parlor politics on her front, that she really was involved in the day to day and all the struggles and all the sacrifices that meant for her. And I thought it was a great kind of follow on to the kind of low point of Paris in A Bakery in Paris to follow up with the Paris in Triumph.
It's fascinating because you do learn a lot of things that you probably, at least I didn't know about the Eiffel Tower.
Mm-hmm.
One of which was it's beloved now. It's a symbol that people recognize and adore. But when it was being built, not everyone was a fan.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yep. It was meant to be a parlor trick. It
Oh,
was meant to just be, a cool thing to open up the
Paris
World's
exhibition.
Fair.
Yeah.
And it was going to be temporary 20 years. And, these are things that people aren't necessarily super familiar with, but it was painted bright red. That hence, I was so glad they listened to me on the cover. They painted it bright red.
Oh,
Um, yeah, and I actually mocked this cover up. We went through a couple renditions. I had a friend who was really good at design, actually helped me mock it up to show them what I was trying to convey, and they liked it.
oh,
So
good.
that was great. But yeah, it was meant to be temporary, but it became just a fixture, not just because of the revenue it was bringing in, but its scientific utility. It was, it's still, and important as a weather station and radio tower to this day.
The one of the other things I learned was that Gustave Eiffel did more than just create the tower.
Mm-hmm.
He did so many different things. I mean, he built bridges in Portugal, and
Yes.
there were he did I guess the internal guts. I'm not sure what the exact term is, but for the Statue of Liberty
Yeah,
and
the
stuff.
entire working. If you go inside the Statue of Liberty, it kind of looks Eiffel Tower-esque
Mhm.
because it's kind of the same, the same aesthetic, the same framework for the famous structure or for the famous statue. And I debated. I really wanted to put a scene in America with the Statue of Liberty, but I could not. And this is amazing to me. I could not establish whether or not Gustav went to the U.S. to see it commemorated or anything. So I had to assume he wasn't there because I couldn't corroborate that he was. But yeah, I was disappointed. I really wanted to write a scene there. But I try to stick to the facts as much as I can. But of course, Claire is largely lost to history. And despite spending a tremendous amount of time in the archives in Paris, I was left to construct a lot of her life from what I knew of her father's, because I knew that they were together. And I knew that largely because there wasn't correspondence between the two of them during a large part of when the book takes place. There was a tremendous amount between Claire and her extended family when after her mother died and when they were traveling to Portugal. She's very worried about her younger siblings in the care of her aunt and uncle and grandparents and how they're all faring. And there's a tremendous amount after the Eiffel Tower and after Gustav has gone into quasi-retirement, because he went traveling and he'd stay in one family villa or another, and she would be somewhere else, and they would write frequently, but not during this key period of the Eiffel Tower. She was needed. She had to be there.
And then kind of he had Gustav, her father, had this kind of legendary career, but it kind of ended tragically. And
Mm-hmm.
I had kind of known bits and pieces about the Panama Canal, how several attempts had been made to get the canal through Panama, but they had failed until the last effort by the Americans. But I had no idea that he was involved in one of those French
Yes,
efforts.
he made the locks, and he was able to successfully do his part of the contract. And the scandal was that he was hired to do a specific thing, but he was brought on too late to the project to save it. But he did what he was contracted to do. It just was too little too late. But he made a profit, and people were not happy given that 800,000 Parisians lost their pensions or lost their life savings because they invested so heavily in this project. And it was just too little too late. And so he became one of the kind of scapegoats for the Panama Canal scandal. And I think that, it probably would have been better if he'd not taken payment for his work, or at least not a profit. But, he was really not the chief person to blame in this whole affair. Yeah, I became convinced of that, even though he was kind of a bit maligned. And it's remarkable that he really isn't more of a prominent figure in French history. It's amazing to me that how few books there are really about him. I mean, there's a few, certainly. Two really good ones in English. Well, actually, I think one of them is a translation. But it's, compared to other men of similar clout, he is not celebrated like a famous son of Paris normally would have been. They didn't afford him a place in the Panthéon, and they did not bury him with all the pomp and circumstance that normally would have happened. He was buried in Levallois-Perret with his wife, which is probably what he would have preferred anyway. But because he never remarried, even though he was widowed in his 30s, he would have been. I'm sorry, his wife was in his 30s. He would have been in his 50s because he was significantly older than she was. And it was an arranged marriage, but they'd known each other. But it was interesting. But yeah, it was interesting that he was a bit maligned in history, even though he was eventually acquitted of his crimes and he only spent a week in prison. It had to have been like the longest week of his life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Now you said you did research, and the research was there's actually archives, Eiffel Archives.
Yes, the Eiffel family archives are housed at the Musée d'Orsay, and I got permission to go. I went one day while I was on vacation with my husband in 2022, but then I got to go back for an entire week in spring of 23, and I got to spend 3 full days in the archives, which is extremely generous.
Mhm.
And then I got to spend other time like doing on the ground research, seeing the places where Claire grew up, the church where she was married, the exterior of the house where where a lot of this takes place on Rue Fouquet. No, is that right? Rue Prony. But it's now like an insurance building. It's like office buildings, and their beautiful house on the Rue Rabelais. That was his big triumph, showpiece of a house. Has been torn down. It's now an embassy, which is unfortunate. So yeah, going to be able to see, the places that were significant to her. And of course, going up back to the top of the Eiffel Tower for the first time in roughly 25 years was great. It was amazing. Yeah.
Um, what did you discover while you were doing your research about the Eiffels that surprised you?
Well, the fact that she lived with her father for the rest of his life was, I mean, it was well known, but it's still shocking. But I found in their ledgers that she and her husband paid rent.
Oh,
Yeah, and so I found that super interesting. So, I think that Gustav and Adolphe, her husband, got on like a house on fire. They loved each other. And I think that Gustav was pleased to no end that she chose to marry this man. But they tried to keep, I think it's like there's an expression in France, les bons comptes font des bons amis. Good accounts make for, or good ledgers make for good friends. And they kept everything above board. And I think that that was one of the keys to their happy household. And I can imagine that in some sense, it was easier for Claire to live under the same roof as her husband and her father, rather than feeling like she'd abandoned her father, that she'd basically done, been his helpmeet for, a decade before she found her husband.
when you're writing historical fiction, there's kind of a line you have to walk as an author between
Mhm.
how much historical fact can you incorporate in the story, what as a writer can you kind of imagine or envision in the storyline. How do you find yourself walking that line in the case of Mademoiselle Eiffel?
Okay, in the case of this book, I think, I did my due diligence to learn everything I could about the Eiffel family and Gustave in particular. And everything that I couldn't prove, or that there was not enough material there to formulate a story, that was fair game for creativity. Because we do not know, we didn't find any intimate journals, we didn't find, diaries or, forlorn correspondence to other members of the family. Um, so, I felt very comfortable inserting, like, there are a couple characters, Pauline the maid, Ursule, her best friend, who are complete fabrications of my own. But they served a distinct purpose. Pauline was there to help her learn how to be lady of the house. Ursule was her doppelganger. What if she'd been able to pursue her art? And her art was a contrivance of my own, because it was clear from the letters that she wrote that she was a very, very bright woman. And I wanted to give her an aspiration of her own to become a renowned artist, because this is the high period of French art. This is the era of the Impressionists and the Great Salon and all those beautiful things. And I wanted her to long to be a part of it, but having to sacrifice that to be part of her father's world. And it was a ladylike enough pursuit, painting, to be plausible. And it was also kind of a link to her father's world in design.
Mhm.
And so I thought it would also serve to make her useful, because she has the eye of an artist. And that would be, incredibly useful to an architect. And, she has an appreciation for his ability to blend the functional with the beautiful, and to make something extraordinary. And she respects that a great deal.
Yeah, and it's not a stretch to envision that as a potential career path because there were women artists that
Hmm.
had come up through France. So it's not like it was a scandalous career or something that women could not participate in. It was definitely an option, but I like there's a scene in the book where her friend kind of tells her, you're choosing to give up your art to help your father and help his career. And she really kind of struggles with that a little bit.
Yes, she does. And I think that that's relatable. I hate to think of these women from the 19th century being painted as self-effacing entirely.
Mhm.
They weren't selfish women, but they weren't entirely selfless either, even though society would have preferred that they were. And that's the thing, like, she has just a smidgen of regret, a smidgen of, wanting something bigger for herself, to be able to make her own mark on the world the way her father has done. But she has to sacrifice that. And I think that that is not selfish. I think it's just not entirely selfless.
Mhm.
And that is something that I really kind of, thought about a lot in the course of writing this book. I was watching the marvelous Mrs. Maisel a lot while I was writing that, and she crosses the border line to being selfish a few times, more often than not. But at her core, the big problem is that she's not selfless entirely. And isn't that a theme that happens so often? Is that we don't make a strong enough distinction between a woman giving of herself for her family and giving all of herself. And that's what I wanted to get after.
Yeah, that really was effective. You got that nuanced
Mhm.
portrayal of her. One of the other characters in the books that you either love or hate is her grandmother. Is it Bon Maman?
But Bonne Maman, which
Yeah.
is kind of a Dijonais, we all know the jam, right? Bonne Maman,
Hmm.
the jam. It means grandma, and it
Oh,
is a regionalism that means grandmother. Yeah, good mother. It's good mother, but it's yeah, that's
grandmother.
regionalism. I learned about that in this book.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm guessing, were there actual records as to her characters, or that just how you envisioned her?
Oh, she like there was a letter that Claire wrote to her aunt, worried about the influence that her grandmother would have on Laure, her second sister, her sibling right below her. And she was definitely the one that put all the historical records indicate that she was the one that was basically the driving force behind her husband's success and her son's. And so I don't think that it is really a stretch to say that she was a force of a personality. I possibly made her more nasty than she might have been. Apparently, she was illiterate, which is incredible.
Oh,
But she and I can't remember where I read that, but I know I read that at least once that she wasn't able to read and write, and or at least not extensively. But she was definitely a canny old woman, and Claire was really worried that her grandmother would be kind of a hardening influence on her younger sister. And but at 14, she's having these very grown-up worries about her 13-year-old sister. And that shows that she'd been taking over the role of mother for a little while before her mother died. Because this is within 2 months of her mother's death that letter was written too. And her and so it's funny, as I started this book in 3 different places, and my agent kept saying, you're not starting in the right place, hon, you're not. And finally, when I brought Bonne Maman to the forefront, and oh well, at least the hard part's over at the begin at her mother's funeral, and everybody just turning their heads like the hard part's just getting started. The grieving process is just the beginning, the end of the beginning of the grief process. And just her being completely sort of, I don't know, having a callus around her heart concerning matters of family and emotion, and her caring so deeply about appearances above anything else. And she was tremendously fun to write. So
you did a great job. I also appreciate, I mean, in one sense, she is kind of this dragon figure, but you also, I'm paraphrasing, but at one point somebody says, like, if she had been a man, she would have been a general or the head of a business or something like that because she was that strong and that authoritative.
yeah, exactly. And she was kind of scorned because she was a woman. If it had been a man in that role, nobody would have loved him, but they would have respected him.
Yeah.
And they would have been like, he would have had a wife that was perhaps softer with the children, and managing all their affairs. And he would be the person that came around, and the children would see him for 1 hour every day when they were spit polished and starched and ready to, pay homage to their father. And then they'd be whisked away to eat in the nursery. And that's the way those families worked. But when it's your mother in that role, it's harder.
Yeah.
It is harder.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process because that can differ from author to author. When you begin a project, do you always know, do you like to know everything in advance? Do you kind of leave things open to circumstance or chance or serendipity? How do you approach a project?
I think that every project is different. I do like having a sense of the major arc of the story. And in this one, it was very clear that there were going to be 3 separate sections. There was going to be the period right around the time her mother died,
Mhm.
time jump forward to her courtship and the building of the Eiffel Tower, which happened roughly at the same time or over the course of a few years. And then, the jumping a little bit further in time to the Panama Canal scandal. And those were, and so I knew that I wanted to not shortchange the Eiffel Tower chapters. And so I did something a little bit unorthodox for myself. And I had to write the opening chapters, for us. Actually, I didn't have to turn in opening chapters for this book on submission, but I wanted a good foundation. So I wrote 3 or 4 chapters in the beginning, but then I skipped ahead and wrote the Eiffel Tower chapters while my energy was fresh and I wasn't feeling rushed by deadlines or something, so that they would feel, kind of organic. And it worked really well. Now, I've written out of sequence before and it made it harder, but because I had a really strong sense of character and what I wanted to do, I thought it managed to work itself out. And then I finished that. I finished the Eiffel Tower section, which is really the meat of the book. And then I jumped back and finished out the childhood period and then finished with the Panama Canal part. And that was really the hardest part. And I ended up like, I submitted a book in May, and then I actually, it wasn't entirely complete. I can confess this now that the book is out and on time. But I a couple months later sent my editor another message saying, this version's a little bit more polished. Why don't you edit that? As I got 6 more chapters in it because I actually finished the whole thing. But that happens sometimes. It's better to turn something in and close to deadline. But yeah, the ending needed the oomph. And I was able to pull in a lot of my notes from my actual travels at that point. Because and the deadline didn't feel like it was pressing down so much anymore. And it made it easier to get through those difficult chapters because it was hard because I love these characters. I hated to put them through the worst days of their lives again. But that's part of my job.
You've written a number of books and you've had them published to your credit. Does it get easier with each book, or is each book a different kind of challenge?
Every book is a different challenge. Some are easier than others. A Bakery in Paris will always be beloved. And it was a book that kind of was, because the School for German Brides was so dark and so hard. It was my lockdown book. And by that, I mean, I was homeschooling my children, newly single mother at the time, homeschooling my kids during the day and writing that book in 300-word chunks in the middle of the night. And it's so dark. And it was a good thing I wasn't trying to write something like Lavender and Sage under those circumstances, because it would have turned into some gothic horror or something instead of, light and cheery contemporary. But, it came a lot more easily. My life was improving. Like things were easing up. I moved to Estes Park, my happy place. And so it was kind of like a triumphant comeback, as far as like, but I mean, German Brides did beautifully, and A Bakery in Paris, but it felt like the triumphant comeback from my muse. And the other book that came really easily, partially because the research was so plentiful, was Girls on the Line, which was my 4th book. About the telephone operators in World War I. I get to revisit that topic in The Liberty Scarf, which is a co-authored novel with my friends Rachel McMillan and Janelle Soselsky. And I get to revisit the Hello Girls, who were the telephone operators, the American telephone operators in World War I, which was great fun to reuse that. But, with Mademoiselle Eiffel, the simplicity of it was that I had the story arc in my head very clearly. Like I didn't feel like I had to outline what was going on. And I had a strong sense of who Claire was, but I had to invent a lot of it. And I felt like I had to double check everything to make sure that there wasn't stuff that was directly contradicting what I wanted to do. And there wasn't a lot of information to do that with. And, with like Lavender and Sage, the hard part with that one was breaking into a new genre. Yeah.
In addition to writing, you also, I believe, teach creative writing?
Yes, I do, for Drexel University, which is wonderful.
There's a lot of people out there that want to become writers. What's the best advice you could give them to start off?
Just keep writing. Stop aspiring, start writing. And just getting your rear end in the chair, setting word goals, trying to touch your story every day. And I know you don't have to write 1,000 or 2,000 words every single day, but if on your off days, even on the weekend when you're packed with kids sports practices, my kids started volleyball and robotics this year. If you can, on your days where you don't have time to write, have a file on your phone and add a few sentences or reread what you've already written. Touch the ball every day. And that's super useful, but you don't feel like you have to get down, 2,000 words every, Saturday and Sunday, if you're committed with family stuff. But your writing should be something that, you guard your writing time as much as you can. Set aside a period of time every day that is convenient for you and the people you live with. And, make sure that they know that this is sacred time, and, have a designated workspace that's all your own if you can manage it. And of course, I'm coming from a place of privilege, and when I started writing, my children were infants, and, I could stash them in their bedrooms to take naps. My husband was away at work, and, I could find a place of peace. But even if it's a corner of a room that that you can designate as your own, I think that that's valuable to have. And I think that, just acknowledging that you're worthy of being a writer and that your story deserves to be told. You just tell that to yourself over and over again. It took me the longest time to be able to give myself permission to write a book, but I realized nobody's going to come around and pin a little brass star to your shirt that says writer, and tell you that you've got permission to write a book. It's not like being a sheriff. And for some reason, that's the metaphor I always use. It's like being anointed a writer. I don't have an MFA. I teach for the MFA program. I have a master's and other things that allow me to teach. But, it's, you don't have to have all those nice things. Is it great if you can get extra training and learn the skills from the masters? Sure. But you don't have to have those things.
Let's talk a little bit about you as a reader, because I know some writers only read what they write, others read across the map. What has your journey been like as a reader? Do you write historical fiction because that's what you first fell in love with as a reader?
Yes, that's actually true. I gravitated toward historical fiction as a writer because that was what I loved reading. I remember, historical romance and historical fiction were kind of my, go-to books when I was a kid. I remember my sisters loved the Sweet Valley High books when they were younger, and I thought they were okay. They were cute, but they came out with this historical saga about their great great grandmothers, and it was like on down the line. And I loved the format. I loved everything about it. I read them until the covers literally fell off when I was in middle school, and that was kind of the start of it. And then when I was in college, I got a gift card to Powell's City of Books because I was living in Portland. Well, I was living in Minville, Linfield College, but they were living in Portland, and I got this really nice gift card, and this literal city of books, and it's overwhelming. And I asked my uncle, who's a very erudite, learned man, and I said, I love books set in the past. He's like, oh, historical fiction. And I didn't even know what it was called. I was like some dumb 18-year-old. He's like, you need to read Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And I fell in love. I absolutely fell in love. So that was one of those books that was really formative. That and The Handmaid's Tale, from a feminist perspective, are two books I feel like have become part of my soul. But now I do read across genre because I feel like if especially if I'm drafting, I'm not going to read or listen to. I listen to a lot of audiobooks because I have to drive a lot. I I try not to listen to something that's super close to what I'm drafting, which is not hard to do. You can avoid reading World War II fiction while you're drafting World War II fiction. But I feel like if it's emotionally sort of like not poignant enough, picking up something that is really emotionally moving, or if the pace is dragging, read a really well-paced mystery. And so I'm kind of a polyglot as a reader and a listener. And I've really fallen in love with audiobooks the last few years, because I've got a lot of long drives down the plains to take my kids to their father. And we've all, I listen to a book with the kids on the way down when I'm dropping them off, and listen to my own book on the way back. And so it's kind of a family affair. It's great.
Have some of your books been turned into audio books?
Yeah, all of my books are in audio, all of them, which is great. Caroline Hewitt is amazing. She did, I fell in love with her. She narrated, it was by Anma, as a book about Jackie's year,
In Paris.
Jacqueline in Paris.
Yeah.
Jacqueline in Paris. And Caroline Hewitt narrated that book, and she also narrated this book, as well as half of A Bakery in Paris, and part of The Liberty Scarf, and A Memory of Lavender and Sage. She's become the voice of my brand. And she really gets what I'm trying to do. And she's extremely talented and got a great French accent. So
great.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit about what's coming, but can you tell us any more? Because I'm really interested in Liberty Scarf. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so my next book is called The Wandering Season. It comes out April 1st of next year, April Fool's Day. And it's my next contemporary, and it's kind of in the same universe as The Memory of Lavender and Sage with all new
Oh,
characters. But there's a little bit of, a very minor hint of magical realism in Lavender and Sage. And
mhm.
that's, there's little spider webs that connect this little universe of mine. And I love that for these women because they're all special. They're all sort of intertwined. And it's a story of a woman who Veronica Stratton, who lives in Denver, and opens up in Estes Park. I get to write one chapter in my favorite place in the world, and she comes home for Christmas, and she's healing from a breakup that her family doesn't know about, and she gets a DNA test for her Christmas from her sister. And she's kind of always felt like the odd duck in the family. And she's known for years that she was adopted. She figured it out in genetics class when she was in high school, that she had too many recessive traits to be a coincidence. And so when her sister hands out the DNA kits for everybody, her parents freak out, and she says, "Calm down, I know." And it brings a lot of things to the surface. And her family ends up sending her to Europe to visit all the places that her ancestors come from. And while she's there, she sees visions of the women from her family on the point where they decided to emigrate to the United States. And so she travels from, Colorado to Ireland, to the Westport in the west coast of Ireland, Benac-et-Cazenec, which is a beautiful village in the southwest of France, and a little village outside of Milan in Italy, and a very brief stint in Copenhagen, Denmark. And that's why it's called The Wandering Season. And she learns a tremendous amount about herself and dealing with her, trauma of realizing that she wasn't part of her family, or never really felt part of it once this truth came out, and sort of shortchanging herself, and her coming to terms with that.
And how can readers learn more about you and your books?
Well, I have a lovely website, www.aimiekrunyan.com, and I am active on Facebook, Instagram, Threads on occasion, and rarely TikTok and Twitter. So yeah, so you can find me on any of those platforms, but Instagram and Facebook are the most reliable.
That's great because I noticed at the back of Mademoiselle Eiffel, you have book club discussion questions. So I'm guessing
Yes.
you're open to connecting with book clubs.
Yes, there are some lovely questions in the back that they let me include. And if you want me to join your book club, just shoot me an email.
It's great.
Yeah, there's a contact me form on my website, and they'll send it right to my email box.
I can't believe how quickly our time has flown by
I
once again
know.
with Aimie. She's the author of a number of fascinating, wonderful historical novels. Her latest is Mademoiselle Eiffel, out now at your local bookstore if you're in Arizona, The Poison Pen, or your local library. I'd like to thank Aimie for taking time to join us again and for writing such wonderful books. And thank you, audience, for tuning in virtually.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.